Good afternoon. My name is Susan Earle. I'm the main library administrator, and I welcome you to the Nashville Public Library. Just for a few housekeeping points, if you have cell phones, please at this time either place them on vibrating or turn them off. You noticed in your chairs we gave a flyer concerning some of the programs coming up about John Updike, and one in particular I want to mention is November 4th in the auditorium at 10 a.m. He'll be here to speak. We also have books in the hallway next to our wonderful self-check machine, so if you have a library card handy, you're able to check out some books concerning environmental activists. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mary Pat Teague, the Associate Director, Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations at Vanderbilt University.
Thank you very much, and I also want to thank Susan and welcome her to our Thinking Out of the Lunchbox family. As you know, of course, Bruce, our former library person, has gone to Texas, but although we miss him, we're delighted to have Susan here with us today. And especially on a beautiful day like today, it's gorgeous in Nashville, and it's a perfect day to contemplate the environment, I think. So we're very fortunate to have this program today. So I just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about some of the things that are going on campus. There's always things going on in Nashville, and Vanderbilt is no different. On the 19th, there's going to be an interesting program at the Inside Out of the Lunchbox program, which is co-sponsored by Vanderbilt and TPAC, and it's at the War Memorial Building. It's going to have a program called Cultural Fusion and Dance at TPAC, and the topic is going to be a panel discussion when East meets West in the world of dance. And I thought it sounded pretty interesting. And this program might be of interest to a lot of you because it always includes a performance. And this time on the 19th, it's no exception. It's going to have a performance by the Chinese Art Alliance of Nashville. So there's information in the back about that. And of course, I can't pass up an opportunity to always promote our program here at the Thinking Out of the Lunchbox. And on November 1st, John McCarthy, I have to get this correct, he's Vanderbilt's director of the Max Cade Center for European and German Studies, and he's also professor of German and comparative literature. And he will speak about reading, writing in the age of consumerism, which of course sounds very timely and fascinating. And of course our wonderful friend David Wood has never led us astray on any of the topics and speakers he's come up with, so I'm sure that promises to be a very good talk. Again, there's information about that in the back. And finally, so we can get on with the program and what we all came here for today, it's my pleasure to introduce our favorite professor of philosophy, David Wood.
Well, thank you so much, Mary Pat, and welcome back again. And thank you, Susan. In fact, if I might, given that we are going to have a kind of environmental activist lunchtime, just ask what happens to all these boxes? And what happens to all the cans and the bottles? Does the library have a kind of recycling program?
Of course we do. There will be 2 recycling bins right behind you, and you're very welcome to put the plastic, the cans in there, and we're hoping to bring 2 more up and handle your boxes. But do flatten your boxes, please.
Okay, thanks so much. So things are moving forward. This is wonderful. I was just calculating, we've thrown away 10,000 boxes since we started. You know, like thinking out of the box, but you've got to think about the box too, right? Well, I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker, Florence Faucher-King. As you know, she's going to be talking about environmental activism, a very topical issue. Anyone who saw Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, or has been listening to the news, realizes these issues are becoming increasingly important for us. And obviously, one of the things that people ask is, well, what can I do? In some of the feedback pages that we've had, you know, we really ought to use smaller sheets for these feedback things. Anyway, sometimes people do say, how about more environmental talks? So we've done that today. Florence Faucher-King is currently, at least legally, a researcher at Sciences Po, the National Foundation for Political Science in Paris, the premier academic institution for the study of politics in France. But right now she's also a visiting associate professor at Vanderbilt, and we're trying to persuade her not to go back. She's a very impressive background. She got her doctorate in political science from Aix-en-Provence in '97. She did research in Oxford, and before her Sciences Po appointment, she taught at Stirling in Scotland. For the last 10 years, she's been conducting research on British political parties. Her specialist interests include green politics, as you can tell, political parties, modern British and French politics, contemporary kinds of political activism, and the application of anthropological methods to the study of political parties. She's published many papers in English and French on these themes, and she's written a couple of books. The first one is Les Habits Verts de la Politique, still in French, for which she won the Philippe Habert Prize in 2000. She looks here at the dilemma faced by green parties of wanting to be sort of different outside the mainstream, even as they become more successful and then move into the mainstream. And more recently, she published her second book, Managing Change in Political Parties, which is on British party conferences. Her current research includes the question of the Americanization of European politics, the politics of food. I was just saying, you know, she's interested in slow food and things like that, and I was thinking, you know, and genetically modified crops versus organic crops. And I was thinking of these lunch boxes. They're not exactly slow or fast. It's kind of fast slow food, sort of an ambiguous category, I think. Dr. Faucher-King is also something of a media regular, if not quite a celebrity, making frequent contributions to international radio and TV forums as an expert on contemporary French and British politics. At Vanderbilt, I know Florence as a delightful colleague and collaborator on the CSRC's Ecology and Spirituality Research Team. She gives us an invaluable, if mildly skeptical, European angle on our attempts to engage Christian and other local communities on environmental matters. That's one of the things that we try to do. Her topic today draws essentially from her research and teaching. Yet as we face the prospect of global warming and all sorts of other issues, it couldn't be more topical or more urgent. And from her talk today on environmental activism, I think you'll see why we're trying to keep her here at Vanderbilt. Florence.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here to talk about environmental activists. Why do people become environmental activists? The question, in a sense, seems somehow a bit odd today, when there seems to be a kind of global consensus now that is emerging on global warming, for instance. As you can see here, I have very important data that actually demonstrates what's been going on. And you can see the trend is very clear. And unfortunately, my data only stops in 1990. More seriously, global warming is taken increasingly seriously by a number of people. In February of last year, 86 senior evangelical scholars and pastors signed a document calling for action on global warming. Business is increasingly taking it seriously. You can see here Richard Branson, who a couple of weeks ago pledged $3 billion for fighting global warming. It's also taken more seriously by politicians. And in fact, politicians seem to be almost competing, in particular in Britain, where you can see here the leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister Blair, the Labour Party leader, shaking hands and with American politicians and competing to be the greenest of them all. In the media, a lot of the newspapers that were skeptical until relatively recently are now embracing issues of global warming and urging their readers to become greener. Newspapers such as the Populist and Popular Sun in Britain, for instance, is now, urging its readers to actually change their lifestyles. When the modern environmentalist movement emerged in the 1960s and 70s, there was no such consensus. And even today, when there is apparently a consensus, the environmental activists remain a minority. We may feel concerned about the environment, but how many of us are actually taking action? How many of us are prepared to change our lifestyles, invest the time, the energy, the resources that we think is necessary to actually affect the way our world is going? So why are some people becoming active whilst the majority remains passive? I've spent, as David was highlighting, many years working with the green activists in Europe. I've lived with them, I've campaigned with them, I've been to hundreds, thousands in fields sometimes of meetings, and I've also interviewed them in depth, trying to find out why they were so mobilized, what were their motivations, and why they were transforming their lives. The people I've worked most closely with are Green Party activists. That is, people who actually believed that their commitment to changing our societies was so important that they also had to make the step of creating and joining a political party and take their political activism into the traditional party sphere. I know that Green Party politics in Europe may seem a little bit far exotic and eccentric here in Nashville. But as you will see, there are many of these experiences that the Green Party activists in Europe have experienced that maybe some of you share. In a sense, the situation is not so different in terms of how we as individuals react to issues that are close to our heart. A key to understand the difference is probably to remember that in Europe, campaigning in a green political party actually makes sense. It is possible. You can achieve things that you may not be able to in all societies. So, who are these activists that we are going to talk about? To many of us, that may be what green activists look like, tree huggers. And it's true that some of them are. These are pictures from the 1990s, anti-road protesters in the UK. But if we consider British and, well, European politics in general in France at the moment, the type of Green Party activists we can think of are also these people. Dominique Voynet, former environmental minister for France, and Joschka Fischer, former foreign affairs minister of the Republic of Germany. Since they were founded in the 1970s, Green parties have not only entered national parliaments in Europe, they have also entered governmental coalitions, and they've been in power in coalitions since 1995 in Finland, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and in Italy. So who are they? Who are these activists? They have the reputation of being young, but if you look at the evolution over the years, they are increasingly less young. Over 40% of them are in their 40s, and the number of younger people, students and so on, joining is no longer the majority. They have spent longer than the majority of people in French or British society, longer than others, time in higher education or in education in general. Higher education not only increases ability to get information, but it also makes people more critical and more able to form an independent judgment. And that is actually very important when it comes down to environmental activism. We'll come back to that. They have often chosen careers in fields that involve communication, public service, or self-actualization. In other words, they are health workers, social workers, teachers, journalists, and so on. They live in small cities and small towns, and even though they are actually not the most likely to benefit from environmental justice because they are sufficiently well off to live in areas that can be relatively preserved, they feel responsible and feel responsible for the lot of people in society that are less lucky. They are also usually active in more than one group. They're not only active in the Green Party, they're also active in a number of organizations, environmental organizations, but also humanitarian organizations in particular. Green politics, and I will use interchangeably, as you'll probably have already noticed, green and environmental activism. I think that the two are increasingly difficult to disentangle in Europe in any case. Green politics is often denounced as being a single issue and therefore not having its place in the political sphere. Well, the argument that is opposed by green activists is that because of the interdependence between all species, any attempt to create a green society rests on actually 4 pillars. Everything is interconnected. So the 4 pillars of green society are sustainability, non-violence, democracy as a means to reach and maintain the sustainable society, but also social justice within our modern societies, Western societies, but also justice across the globe. There are 3 questions I want to address today. How does one become green? What does it mean to see the world through green lenses? How do Greens account for their transformation? So, first thing, turning green. What leads individuals into green activism? Well, not surprisingly, for most of them, nature is very important. And many of the activists I interviewed express their feelings of oneness with the environment, with nature, their spiritual connection. The awe, its beauty inspires them. In Britain, the reference to the spiritual dimension of their involvement is very often put to the fore. The French, on the other hand, are very careful about mixing religion and politics. There is a strong tradition in France of the separation of the church and state, which means that activists, but a lot of French people are basically very careful about never trying to use religious argument when they discuss politics. Whether French or British, they are very critical of the hubris of human nature, but on the other hand, they still put the humans, in a sense, at the center, and they talk more readily about the environment, in a sense, than of nature, i.e. nature in relation to humans. Having these feelings and these emotions when thinking about nature and our connections and the smallness of our planet, here viewed from the moon, there's usually something that moves them and make them react, push them into action. There's usually an event, a discovery, a news that pushes them, catalyst in a sense. In Europe, these catalysts can be nuclear power. For instance, the accident in Chernobyl in 1986, the variety of oil slicks, an accident that have polluted the coast, mad cow disease, or the extinction of species and the melting of the Arctic. For instance, we hear the bears increasingly drowning. Don is a British activist I interviewed, and he expresses here how he feels a reaction of anger and revolt and frustration at politicians for not taking these issues seriously enough. And how also it is important for him to feel that he's doing something, he's playing a part in the transformation. Very often activists had an important moment when reading a book, watching a film, seeing a documentary or so on. For some of them, after reading a particular book, and one of the most popular one in Britain is seeing green. Another book that you may be more familiar with is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that actually played a very important role even for British activists. These readings actually are perceived as turning points that allow them to see the world differently. Also very important is the friends and the connections that allow you to get in touch with a group of activists. Political campaigns are very important for green activism because they provide an opportunity to go and knock on people's doors, to ask people to attend meetings, to come and join and campaign. For other activists, what has been important is their involvement in other groups, in association, environmental groups, humanitarian groups, and so on, where somebody was able to take them to the Green Party, for instance, in this particular case. So most of the activists I met needed to have or had shared not only particular worldviews, but also they all experienced a catalytic moment that pushed them into action and a friend that brought them somewhere. What does it mean to see the world through tinted glasses, and what happens in these moments of discovery? Why do activists, in other words, think that they joined? To make sense of the world we live in, we usually use pre-existing knowledge and frames to understand what is new. So we turn the problematic and the new into the unproblematic by referring, not necessarily consciously, to things we already know. In a sense, we constantly live the world through tinted glasses. We forget that we wear glasses, although I don't, because if I take them off, I don't see anything. But we also see the world through tinted glasses, and we forget which color they are. So how do Greens make sense of the world? What is at stake for them? And that's part of this frame. The first thing that is at stake, according to them, is civilization. Civilization as we know it, and survival. Survival of our species, but survival of other species as well, and justice and fairness. The British are particularly vocal about their fears, and one of their fears is that it will take environmental catastrophes to move other citizens to take action. They're open about the need to appeal to emotions. That's something that is quite different with the French. The French tend to be very reluctant to appeal to emotions. They want to convince rationally, intellectually. One of the ways to explain this is probably to look at the background of activists. In France, 59% of them have a background in science, education background in science. It's only 7% in the UK. So frames are ways to understand and make sense of the world and of politics. So what does a green frame look like? A green frame identifies the problems and the causes of the problems. For instance, global warming and greenhouse gases, and how these gases are produced. It also identifies the strategies, the tactics, the targets of action. And finally, it provides reasons for action. It tells people why they need to be involved now and why they, as individuals, can also make a difference. It provides hopes for success, faith in human nature and in the ability of individuals to play a role individually in the transformation. It makes them believe that the change is possible and that anyone can contribute. And it gives a sense of empowerment and competence. But again, what is very important is the possibility of having conversations. We get our values from the communities we grew up in. Our parents, our peers, our churches, and these values inform and influence our actions. Mike, for instance, was a Green Party activist in Oxford, and he told me how he grew up in a small Christian community. And he explains that his parents were extremely hostile to materialism, so he grew up in a community that was emphasizing non-materialist values and the countryside. Later in life, we join other communities. And we need a community to find a sense of stability, to give us people with whom we can have conversations, like-minded people, to give us the sense that we're sharing values. How lonely for activists who for so many years, green activists who for so many years felt that they were isolated in a world that was definitely grey. People who are isolated, for people who are isolated, it is much more difficult to actually maintain or keep on their green glasses. People who go to church every week, for instance, are much more likely to vote according to what they hear at church and their religious beliefs. Parties hold conventions where their activists, their members, can come together and share their views. These conversations are extremely important to maintain a sense of green view or world view, but it's true for other organizations, for all organizations. When I asked Green Party activists how they made sense of their transformation of their lives, they usually gave me two narratives. The first one was talking about awakening. And for them, awakening, this moment when they actually were able to piece together various aspects of what they knew about the world and give it a frame that interpreted it and made action possible. For some of them, they had also been active for many years in other groups, and there was this moment when they actually were able to understand what was going on. The second aspect was that they very clearly distinguished the moment when they became green in the sense of becoming aware of their green values and a particular frame, their tinted glasses, and the second moment, which is when they joined an organization, a group. And from that moment, the moment of joining a group, their transformation carried on. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So first, the awakening. The awakening is not so much a radical conversion for most people, even though some activists actually explained that they were, in a sense, they felt like they were almost like born again. Most activists, on the other hand, stress a sense of continuity, and they explain how they had always been in ecologists without actually realizing that's what they were, and eventually they found people who were able to explain what they were doing. I'll take the example of Kathryn. Kathryn had a father who was a chemist, obsessed with waste disposal. And he was so obsessed with it that when they were kids, he would make them pick up the garbage of other people when they went picnics. And her mother came from a poor farming background. So she was always conscious about reusing, using carefully and and saving. She behaved like that, and that's how she grew up, and that's how she behaved when she was an adult, and she was always a little bit at odds with the rest of her friends, until she came across green politics and realized that that was the rationale for her action. She could actually make sense of what she'd been doing over these years. Another example is Caroline, who's now a member of the European Parliament for the UK. She explains here how she'd been involved in a diversity of groups, anti-nuclear movement, women's movement, and so on. Reading a book by Jonathan Porte, which is a book I already mentioned, she actually felt like there was a turning point. It pieced together these various parts of her identity and put them in greater perspective. So the awakening is very important. But as I was saying, the awakening is not a moment at which things stop. One becomes green and one is green from then on. People, when they join a community or a group of activists, also engage in a path of self-discovery. Because the awakening leads to curiosity and very often a frenzy of reading and discovering and watching films and documentaries and so on, that in a sense confirm the moment of aha that they had when they pieced things together. One doesn't decide once and for all that one is green. It's a constant battle, if you want. Each time one could take the car rather than cycle. Each time that there's a meeting that is at a very unpleasant hour, one has to decide what one is doing and how committed one is. most Greens I spoke to actually changed their lifestyles after joining the group. And it's through the exchanges, the conversations, that they realized what they could do and how they should do it, how they could actually put consistency, coherence between their public and their private lives. Some people sacrifice some of their aspects of their consumption, others just try to reorganize it. Dominique, for instance, sold her car. Jenny, who clearly lived in England, got rid of her fridge. Sonia started to listen to radio rather than buy newspapers because of the waste it produces. Julie, for instance, told me that she didn't want to be part of the problem, and she believed that there were two aspects to transforming the world. There was first political action, putting pressure on the politicians where it hurts, and that was being involved in a political party. And the second aspect was actually consumer action, and that's why she was doing both. So it's through these examples, the example and the conversations, that the path to self-discovery is explored. The changes that individuals choose to make are related largely to their cultural context. As David has already mentioned, I'm French, and one of the aspects that struck me was the different attitudes to food and to diet. One of the differences between the French and the British was what type of change in their diet they were prepared to make. The British tend to choose to be vegetarian. There are about 4 million vegetarians in the UK. Well, one could say they don't have that much to lose. And that's probably why the French can't take this decision. The French are actually much more concerned about organic farming. Now, there's another explanation, of course. Food is very entrenched as part of French regional and national identity. Being a vegetarian is almost a heresy in France. So for the Greens in France, who had all reduced their consumption of meat, they could not come to terms with saying that they were vegetarian, so they would eat a little bit of meat, for fear of being portrayed as dangerous extremists. What is important here as well is how the Greens believe that it's not through legal norms to forcing people to change their behavior that the Green Revolution is going to happen. What needs to happen is to convince individuals that they need to change themselves. So it's not that by preventing people from buying SUV, but by convincing them that they don't want the SUV, that the Green Revolution is going to happen. To conclude, I'd like to draw a few threads from what I've been saying. People become green activists because they feel a sense of communion with something greater than themselves. But they also need a kind of aha moment, awakening, a moment of catalytic moment. And they very often need to be involved in a group or to be able to connect with somebody who will take them into a group. Now, what is also very important here is that the type of action that they can imagine as feasible and effective is largely related to the institutional context and the cultural context. I took the example of changing one's lifestyle and food. The other example is whether or not it makes sense to create a Green Party and to be active in a party rather than in a different moment. What also international comparison teaches us is how, despite the differences between countries, there are the same emotions and the same moves that take people from being interested in their environment to being prepared to invest their time and their energy and to change their lives for it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just, as you know, I'm going to ask Florence just a couple of questions and then throw it open to the audience for more questions. And I think I'd like to start by asking you about just a comment perhaps on the difference between the kind of activism in which you feel better yourself for doing the right thing. You make changes in your own behavior on the one hand, and on the other, the kind of activism that really thinks very hard about what is really going to make a difference. I guess what I'm thinking is that there is a gap, or there can be a real gap between these two things. I mean, you can make personal decisions without really thinking that it's going to, prevent the end of the world. It's going to make you feel more in harmony with things. But you might not think that that was enough. You might think, I really want to make a difference, in which case you might, is that why people join political parties? And then I guess I'm wondering about whether joining a political party really is likely to be the way in which the kind of dramatic change that we probably need is going to happen. So I just want, perhaps you could just comment on this difference between, if you like, the political activist who really tries to use his or her energies in the most effective way, and the one who really tries to just feel better about their own lives. Is that a difference that you notice in the people you talk to?
Well, everybody tries to feel like they're not wasting their time. So if they're invested in something and they really are committed and spending a lot of time in it, it's likely that they think that it's going to be effective. Otherwise, what they do is they leave the group. That's partly why Green parties have difficulties retaining their members, because after a while, a lot of members actually think that it's not as effective as they thought it was. And for a lot of people, what is important is feeling that they can make a difference as an individual. Now, that's really bound up to how competent you feel about politics, how you feel you can be heard, where you think you can be heard, and where you think you can be most effective. So that will be different from one individual to the next, according to their personal experience in many cases. Now, is joining a Green Party the step that will make the dramatic change? Well, not necessarily. That's why, as I was saying, lots of people leave Green parties in Europe, as many as people who join the Green parties. The second thing is, though, that it's a way to exert pressure, and for a lot of people who actually join parties, they believe that it was the only way where they could actually be heard by politicians, because that's why it hurts, taking votes. And that's possible when the electoral system allows you to actually take votes effectively from politicians. In many countries in Europe, not the UK, but the rest of the European countries, proportional representation is used, which means that you can also get people elected to local councils, parliaments, European parliaments, and so on. So you not only take the votes and create competition for the mainstream political parties, but you also have a chance to be elected. And once you're in the institution, you can contribute to play a role in changing the legislation, for instance, or the regulations at the European level. So that's also important, putting pressure and the taking part. The Greens had big dilemmas about whether to enter coalition governments or not, because they feared, some of them feared, that it would dilute their message and they would be less radical. They would have to make compromises. And most Green parties, at least in France and Germany, the solution that has been found is that it's actually very important to contribute to taking the steps in the right direction. In fact, taking a few steps in the right direction was better than staying outside of politics and complaining that the world is not changing.
Well, my second question is this. When I was a graduate student in the early 70s, this was all the rage. And I'm wondering whether you could comment on the difference between the atmosphere then and the atmosphere now, or if not the atmosphere, but in the sense, why did it die out, and what's happening now, such that there's a kind of resurgence of interest in environmental issues, and do you think it will be different this time round? I mean, I'm sure a lot of members of this audience will know what I'm talking about. That we've been here before, and why did it sort of peter out the last time? And is it just going to be another of those, fairy rings that come up and go down again?
Well, to be honest, David, I don't remember the early 70s.
I knew I was
do.
stepping into that.
I do, but not that much. I was actually born in 1970, so my first memory is 1974, when the French president died and my cartoon on television was cancelled. That's the first memory I have. So the comparison in atmosphere is going to be difficult for me to make in such a matter, in such a fashion. However, what I think is different between now and then is that, as I was highlighting at the beginning of the talk, there is now a consensus that is reaching the higher spheres of politics and business. And these are the two important groups that need to be convinced. When the Club de Rome published their report and so on, these were mavericks, or they were seen as such. Now, the body of research on global warming is such that no one is seriously contesting the results. Moreover, people can witness the consequences of global warming, droughts, storms, and so on. So there is much more material proof, if you want, apart from the knickers I put on the screen, to actually think about how close it is to us, how it touches us personally, and it touches our children and our grandchildren.
Well, we don't have too much time, but I would like to ask you the big question, which is how are things, as an alien in this country, as a European, how does the scene seem different to you, or interestingly different from the one that you would find in Britain or in France? I mean, do you think there are different issues for environmental activists in this country? I mean,
I would say I'm used to being an alien or working in aliens, because when I was working on the Greens, I used to call them my little green men. So that's not so odd. The issues are, in a sense, similar. Some of the strategies have to be different because, in the same sense as French and British societies create different responses, American society requires adaptation of strategies to the way organizations are created, the government is run, and so on. One instance in which Europe and the US are very different is the importance of churches and religion. The French and the British, but the rest of European society are extremely secularized. The majority of Greens declare themselves as without religion. Even those who actually confess that they feel this strong connection, a spiritual connection with the environment, don't make any reference to institutional religion. I think in this country it's impossible to actually create an environmental movement and construct anything without taking into account the importance of religion and churches. So that would be a big difference. The other big difference is, of course, the structure of the political scene. The federal state, the existence of two types of political scenes, the federal scene, but also all the statewide scenes in which you can have Green parties competing and that are not necessarily present at the for national federal election. The other thing is that the electoral system in the US makes it not necessarily very easy or effective to have to construct an action that is around a political party. In a similar sense as in the UK Green Party faces the same problems with the first past the post electoral system that makes it impossible to actually get anybody elected to Parliament. In 1989, for instance, the British Greens got the biggest score ever for a Green Party at an election. They got 15% for European elections. But because of the electoral system, they were not able to send a single MEP to Strasbourg. They have now representatives in the European Parliament, in the regions, but it's because they have changed their electoral system for regional and European elections. So this route might be viable if you have actually the institutions that allow for it.
Great. Well, we're now going to ask for questions from the floor.
Well, I was wondering, you mentioned that the Green Party used to be college students and now it's people in their 40s. Is this because nobody young is joining it and it's ultimately going to die out? This is a concern I have.
Okay, well now remember we just collect these questions into a kind of basket and then give Florence a chance to respond to them all at the end. Yes, there's a gentleman back there.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for hosting this, and I wanted to let you know that there is a Green Party here in Tennessee, and we meet right here at the library on the second Tuesday of every month. And we also have several candidates for statewide office. So if you want to find out more about it, please talk to me afterwards.
And what was your name?
My name is Chris Lugo.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, gentleman back there, and then this gentleman up here. Oh, lady, sorry, it's my glasses. I can't.
My question is, what do the European scientists, you gave us high percentages in Britain and France, think of the number of American scientists who've been hogging the press, still saying there's not definitive science to support the human factors of global warming?
Okay, yes, gentleman here.
You mentioned the importance of American religious institutions in politics in the States. E.L. Wilson has recently put forth a strategy for engaging religious groups in the U.S. On environmental issues. Could you comment?
Can you say any more about Wilson's suggestions?
Not much.
Okay.
Well, he has a very strong conviction that in order to make any headway, that we are going to need the support of American religious groups, and particularly Christian groups.
Okay. Thank you. This gentleman there.
Doesn't U.S. polling data suggest that there's strong, though perhaps superficial, support for environmental issues, as suggested in some of the last elections?
Yes, lady in the red.
Oh, the red hat.
Not the green. Red.
Okay. It was alluded to earlier that the environmentalists sort of got quieted down and weren't as active as they are now. Back in the early 70s and the 80s, well, in fact, in the 60s, I was a very active environmentalist, and I can honestly say that I have stood up to every kind of punishment that anyone could think of, including people messing with my electricity and everything else, and I survived it. So there is a lot of punishment that goes along with being a good environmentalist. I want you to know that. So if you stand up and be a good environmentalist, be prepared to take the punishment that goes along with it, but rely on a higher power, because you'll always come out on top if you do. Thanks.
And you still got some electricity there, I can see. Yeah.
I would like to hear if you know anything about the links between the religious right and the American corporation. When I was in high school, I was sent to Summit. You can go to summit.org to this religious right-wing training camp where Dr. Dobson's kids went. And I was taught and trained that not only was there no such thing as global warming, but also that we should not be concerned about the environment or saving the environment for future generations. Because if I were doing so, I wasn't believing that Jesus Christ was going to come back soon.
I think it's worth noticing that...
And also the Cato Institute and other funding taking over the religious radio stations, which I also listened to nothing but my entire childhood.
It's worth remembering that Pat Robertson has just declared himself a believer in global warming. So It's happening. Any more questions? Yes, there's a lady back there. Can you start again?
I guess my question is more about the green building industry. Seems to be really coming toward the forefront in the last maybe 5-7 years. With the one I'm familiar with is the LEED, which is Leadership of Environmental and Energy Design. And it seems like the pressure and the movement with this one is all more based on not necessarily environmental issues, though that's kind of the background pusher, but a lot of it's being driven by economics, such as energy efficiency and everything else. And so I'm curious as to your take on that as well.
I think we perhaps have time for one more question. There's a lady here.
In the United States, business has been very resistant and a force against change due to environmental factors. Can you comment on how this compares to the attitudes and strategies of business in other countries?
Thank you very much. Should we ask Professor to respond to some of these questions?
Sure. I'll start with the last one. How are European businesses responding differently? A few years ago, one of the key groups of British industrialists actually asked the Labour government to introduce legislation that would help them in introducing green measures in their industries and still be able to compete, so that it was not enough to actually let the industries decide by themselves and lead the transformation. They also needed the role of the state to push a little further. More generally speaking, apart from this awareness and these worries about competition, because the European public are slightly more aware, or have been slightly more aware a little bit earlier than the American public, largely through the role of the press, the European business might be also a bit more informed or worried about how to meet the demands of their consumers. And some of the pressures has come also from consumer protection, especially the regulations introduced at the level of Europe. So it's a complex difference. There were several questions on the role of business and the links between business, corporations, and the right, and so on. The first one was about, and is linked to that actually, was about the role of scientists who claim that there is no such thing as global warming. About a couple of weeks ago, maybe just 1 week actually, the Royal Academy in Britain, which is the leading scientific body, published a public letter urging ExxonMobil to stop funding organizations that promote and fund fake science. And there has been quite a bit of echo about this in the European press in any case, and I think I saw something in here as well. So there is also this issue about companies willingly funding organizations that produce science that contradicts, and fake science that contradicts the rest of the scientific community. I think the other argument there is the role of the media. If the media consistently want to produce the two sides, even when the other side represents 1% of people saying that there's no such thing as global warming, then you are bound to create the impression in the people who are watching the media that actually there is a debate there when there is none. So that's related to the role of corporations in funding science and in their access and their ability to use the media. On the role of the business, again, whether it's driven or not by economics, well, it is likely to be driven at least in part by economics, because industries and businesses are there to make profit. And so it's only when they can actually see that it makes economic sense that they are going to actually transform themselves. Now, some of the industries that have realized how important it is actually to adopt some of these transformations are the insurers, and in particular, those who insure insurance companies, because they know that it's going to cost them much more when they have more Katrina, more hurricanes, more storms, more environmental disasters around. So the economic aspect will always be present, but it is also a question of combining the understanding that it's not by funding fake science, but also that it can make, it makes good sense to actually adopt these changes. A related question, in a sense, is the question of polling and the strong support in the American public for environmental protection. I'm also aware of that, but what is striking there is the unwillingness of the mainstream media to necessarily talk about these issues. And so long as environmental issues do not reach the media agenda, it's more difficult for them to actually reach also the political agenda. And that's where there has been a block so far, or at least in recent years. On the question of punishment and the difficulties of being a green activist, that's something that has been experienced not only by you, but by a lot of green activists everywhere. I mean, there are two kinds of punishment. There's a punishment of deciding that you shouldn't really carry on using a fridge if you only use it for the milk in your tea when you're British, for instance. And I had an example of an old lady who gave up her fridge. Okay, she lived in England. That's slightly different from Tennessee. So there's the self-punishment of that, but there is also, indeed, you know, having to constantly refute people who tell you you are wrong. And a lot of the green activists, and things may change when we all become, of course, environmentally aware, but they have tended to be very strong-willed, determined, and convinced of their good cause, so that they could actually resist. Actually, David is passing on to me a question that I wanted to ask you and forgot. How many of you here are environmental activists? Don't be shy, be proud. Thank you, quite a lot of you. It's good to be in such good company. Right, there was a question on religion and how to engage religious communities. Well, my first response is, in a sense, I don't know, because I'm too unfamiliar with the American context. However, there are a number of initiatives, in particular at Vanderbilt here. The group that David is the coordinator of, the CSR, the Ecology and Spirituality group of the CSRC, is trying to engage religious communities by bringing together religious leaders and, you know, representative pastors from different churches in particular, so that they could actually engage together, talk together, and start discussing these issues in their churches, and maybe start talking about the issue in their sermons. So that's the first thing I would say. Otherwise, I can't tell you much more than that. Last thing, are the Greens likely to die out? Because they've grown older. That's a difficult one. It's true that the average age has grown, has been pushed further. But if we look at the people who are actually involved in political parties, not only in the Green Party, but in other parties, they're all getting older. So it's just that, you know, there's maybe an aging journey, speaking of people who are engaged in politics in general. To give you an example, the average age in the British Green Party is about 46 probably. The average age in the Conservative Party in the UK is 65. So I think before we worry about the Greens dying out, I think there is a serious worry for the Conservative Party. Sorry? Yeah. Somebody added a question saying that his or her 8th grade son is very interested in this and would like to nurture his interest. What are the best reads? Well, actually, I don't quite know yet. My daughter is only 3, so I can't tell for 8th graders. But I think the librarian here would be the best resource for these issues.
And I would like to say the books on our book display don't actually have much value if they stay in the library. And I would encourage you to look at the display and check some of those books out. There are ones that are very local to Tennessee on environmental activism, and there are some which are obviously much broader in their scope. So do check out those books from the library, and let me join with you in thanking today's speaker.
Yes, lots of information.